Hello and welcome to this webinar discussing navigating enterprise resilience. We're going to have a lively and enlightening discussion discussing the trends, challenges, and the roles of mapping dependencies from an enterprise, operational, and cyber resilience perspective. This webinar is sponsored by Phenomenati and vArmour. Our panel today, we have an incredibly experienced and expert group with experience as practitioners, leaders, consultants, and resilience product and service developers. First, we'll begin with a little introduction of our panel, and then we'll move into the webinar itself. My name is Mark Woolward, and I'll be your facilitator. I am the Chief Technology Officer and the CISO at vArmour, and I have a long history of architecting and operating highly resilient systems. In my previous role at Goldman Sachs, I was both CTO for networking and telecommunications, but in my role as technology fellow, I also led the application resilience program for the EMEA region. Now, rather than hear me droning on for the next couple of minutes, gentlemen, could each of you introduce yourselves, beginning with Scott?
Sure. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for the intro from the vArmour team. Scott Foote, Managing Director, currently at Phenomenati Consulting. Here in Phenomenati, I play several roles like a virtual CISO for a lot of our clients. I am a DPO, Data Protection Officer for a few of them. My background, pretty much the first half of my career was as a product engineer and product executive, focused on security, but also focused on performance and availability of extremely large-scale distributed systems. The latter half has been on the other side of the table as a consumer of those types of technologies. And that is in my CISO role, for example, where availability today is more challenging than it's ever been. And we're going to get into that in some detail. So let me cut to the rest of our panelists.
Joel?
Good morning. I'm Joel Jacobs. I'm also with Phenomenati Consulting, a managing director, where I concentrate on vCIO roles and IT strategy. Also do a good deal of work in cybersecurity strategy. In a past life, I was the Chief Information Officer and Chief Security Officer of the MITRE Corporation, which is now very well known through the MITRE attack framework, but has been in the cybersecurity business since there was a cybersecurity business. And I spent a good portion of my career there and as a consultant at other times.
Thanks, Joel. And finally, Matt.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Matt Eben, and I am the VP of Sales and Field Engineering here at vArmour. I've been doing that for a little over 10 years now. Prior to vArmour, I was very heavily involved with developing large-scale, highly resilient, highly redundant security infrastructures and architectures. Before that, was responsible for all reliable and resilient application delivery for one of the world's largest life insurance companies. So 22 years background of delivering resilient and highly available application and security architectures. So very much looking forward to the conversation today.
Thanks very much, guys. So, and thanks to all of our panelists for introducing themselves and for coming to speak to us today. As you can see, we're incredibly fortunate to have such an expert panel. Okay, so let's move on. So before we get underway, just a quick overview of the topics we'll try to cover in the next 45 minutes or so. First of all, we're going to talk about why resilience matters now. Why is resilience so incredibly important to the digital enterprise and the way that the digital enterprise operates within critical national infrastructure? From that, we're going to start to talk about why this can be challenging in today's complex environments. What are organizations seeing as they're trying to become more resilient and more resilient against both operational and cyber threats? And inevitably, as we move down that path, we're going to begin to talk about things like asset discovery, asset classification, and application dependency mapping. And towards the end, we're going to have a quick talk about how vArmour handles this, and we'll get into a demonstration and finish off with a Q&A. Okay, so to kick things off, let's start with why we're here today, and why operational and cyber resilience have become so important, particularly as we contrast it with our previous priorities of business continuation, recovery, and response. Joel, if we could begin with you, could you kind of give us an overview and an introduction of what's happening and why operational resilience has become such a big thing?
So the challenges that that companies are facing, and certainly among our clientele are facing, is the ability to continue operations in the face of many things that are trying to disrupt it, whether it's cyber attacks or the complexity of environments getting to the point where there's so many dependencies, such that it's very easy to wind up with an environment that is effectively being disrupted, whether it's intentional or not. Among our clientele, we have examples of companies that are even having trouble figuring out which is the most important parts of their IT and operational environment for a given process, and the ability to understand what the dependencies are is getting increasingly important. It's noted that there's a regulatory priority, especially in environments and organizations that have either a national security or critical infrastructure role to play, and the ability to articulate and prove that they've got resilience built into the environment is increasingly important. We're seeing examples where the search for data centers or cloud operations that are not only high reliability, but build in the necessary failover and resilience response so that they're able to essentially fight through as opposed to recover. And this is getting increasingly common in the expectations of their customers.
Yeah, so you talked about the requirement to be able to prove that there is an understanding of what makes up a critical business function or an important business service. So there's a reporting aspect here for sure. But that information, and if it's accurate and if it's up to date, it can allow you to do other things more effectively as well. Scott, do you want to talk through some of the uses of this information and how it can make organizations more effective?
Absolutely. I think it informs the decisions we make, investing in terms of how are we going to modernize the infrastructure, right? Many of our clients are in the process of modernizing infrastructure that could be decades old, literally 20 plus years old. More important from my perspective would be, how am I going to defend it? Where do I spend the majority of my resources as a CISO to defend the company and its core business systems if I don't have that knowledge of what my dependencies are? And the dependencies are becoming more and more complex, right? There are many dependencies. We talk about shadow IT all the time. I like to talk about shadow dependencies, where the business has a critical dependency that hasn't been expressed to the CIO or the CISO. So without that, we're making insufficient investments to fortify operational resiliency. Those kinds of decisions are critical to the business, as we've seen in the contested domain that Joel was just talking about. But it's now an obligation, a legal obligation, for us to maintain that awareness, that cyber awareness of where everything is, what the state is, and most importantly, what is the level of critical dependency we have on it, and are there contingencies in place? It isn't just a good and useful thing to have to inform decisions. regulations all over the world are beginning to hold us personally liable, not just the business, but the executives, right down to the CIO and CISO. We have personal liability for maintaining this kind of situational awareness.
And that kind of leads us to the second part of this slide, which is the kind of the governance and the leadership piece. If you look at all of the operational resilience regulations that have popped up around the world over the last few years, if you look at DORA and NIS2 in the European Union, if you look at CPS 230 in Australia and many others, including actually the NIST cybersecurity framework too, there's a governance aspect. And what's being required now that board level and executive level teams are managing technology risk, or take responsibility for technology risk in a way that they used to do for financial risk. So actually it's being elevated because the digital infrastructure is of the same level of importance to many organizations. I'd kind of like to throw it out there. I'd like to ask an open question. Why do you think this is? And how is this going to change organizations, or how should this change organizations and the way they think about their ICT and technology risk? Scott?
Let's give Matt a chance to chime in first. I mean, I can speak for an hour on this topic, but let's give Matt a couple of minutes of airtime here.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, it's going to require organizational changes, right? Structural changes. And we're seeing it more and more. I mean, if you watch LinkedIn, for instance, just the number of people who have head of technology risk as they're in their profile has just exploded in the last couple of years. And things like DORA and CPS 230 and stuff, actual regulations that have some teeth behind them are really driving that even further. We're seeing that accelerate. So forward-thinking organizations are already tackling this and starting to align their corporate structure to attack this. But it's going to be something that we see across the world, across the globe in the very near future here, I would say.
Joel, would you like to add something in your role as a CIO?
Yeah, a couple quick items. One is that if you interacted with a board 10 years ago on technology risk or cybersecurity risk, unless it was fundamental to an operation like a financial institution, it was not something that they were paying that much attention to. It was sort of indirect expectation that we've got somebody who handles that for us. Now it's much more central to the recognition that risk management and technology and cyber risk is something that they are required to pay attention to. NACD, National Association of Corporate Directors, published a handbook on this about 5 years ago, and they've updated it, I believe, once since. But the expectation is that even if board members aren't expert in this kind of risk, they ought to know what the right questions to ask are. What they ought to know the right questions to ask so that they understand that the management has a good understanding of what's going on.
I would echo that by saying that for decades we've gotten away here on the technology side with governance by anecdote, because our board and many of the C team did not have the depth and the technical implementations of any of our systems, right? Other than the fact that they've got an endpoint attaches to a network and away we go, it'll tap onto a server. They didn't truly understand the complexities. That's no longer possible, right? Legally, we're all being held to that level of due diligence that says you need to know. Governance by anecdote is not acceptable. You need to have the fundamental understandings of where your critical choke points are, your single points of failure. What could be a lights out event for the business damaging its operational resiliency? It's now a legal requirement, so boards are digging deeper. And to Matt's point, they're actually assigning new positions on C teams to specifically gather the due diligence and provide this level of understanding of all the inner workings of the company and just how critical those dependencies are, and not just on technology, but the vendors that provide that as well.
And certainly we've seen that with personal fines. We know that regulators are taking action to disqualify individuals. All of those kind of actions are, really can kind of focus the mind. Speaking to some of the larger kind of, global enterprises that are struggling with this, I think we're at the stage now where we have technologists who are passionate and expert about this in place. We have board level recognition, and I think part of this is creating the governance structures through those organizations to make sure that that it's all connected. And I think that's something that, if you look at the Articles of DORA, there's some very explicit guidance on that. Let's just hop back as well to one of the questions about why this is so important. And Scott, I mean, we're now reaching the stage where I think that there's an acceptance that in these complex, fast-moving environments, incidents are becoming inevitable, and to an extent much more frequent. Can you describe what's happening here? How have we moved from the kind of trying to prevent the breach to recognizing that the risks are constant and at some point incidents are going to occur and we need to work out how to be resilient to them?
I think there's been a couple of overlapping trends here. The first is obvious, the threat trend, where there's very low risk to the individual perpetrating the threat over international borders. The threat has skyrocketed. The second is the complexity of systems has grown 3 or 4 orders of magnitude in just the last 20 to 30 years. So it's the vulnerabilities are more plentiful that can be attacked by an adversary. There are more soft spots. I hear it talked about all the time as an attack surface. And while I like that, I wouldn't say it's two-dimensional, right? Surface kind of implies it's two-dimensional. I think there's n dimensions to it because of its complexity. More importantly, the exposures where companies used to be able to survive the exposure, the incident didn't need to be reported unless it spilled maybe privacy data for consumers. There weren't reporting requirements, notification requirements on the entities. So they did what the best they could for operational resiliency, but also not to allow the incident to get out there in the public and damage its reputation. All of these things are getting significantly more serious for the C team. And we're at a point today where even the simplest of an incident is now being required by the C team to be escalated. And then there's discussion amongst not just the technologists, but the business players in terms of, is this a material event? Even if it didn't shut down operations, is it a material event that is reportable both to the board as well as all the external stakeholders in the company? So there are lights being shined on all of this, on the threat ramping, on the vulnerability due to all the complexities, on our lack of knowledge of all of those dependencies, but also on our obligations for reporting the incidents when they happen. All of these things have advanced to the state where we are today. And I think while I disagree with some of the reporting 24 hours kinds of thing like we saw originally from the SEC draft, I think the regulations are a good and useful thing to hold all of us to that due diligence standard, because the threat's not going away and these systems are not getting any less complex.
Right. Okay, so let's talk a little now. Let's kind of switch gears, although you did just talk about a little bit about the complexity and why this is happening more often. Let's talk a little bit about why this is happening now, what's changed and why it's a challenge. So I'm going to begin here. Enterprises are now digital, whereas 20 years ago, aspects of the business were digital, were application-based. There were many pieces that weren't connected digitally. And what's happened since then, the digital systems have been interconnected. We've been through services-oriented architectures, microservices architectures, which are further decomposing the applications that we depend upon. And the formerly few monolithic systems have now decomposed into much more distributed and much more diverse and heterogeneous environments running in, on-premise data centers, clouds, dependent upon third parties. But these kind of two factors, the importance of digital and the complexity, aren't everything. There's this third kind of factor here, which is the rate of change. And I think this is an area that Phenomenati have done a lot of work in. And Scott, could you talk to us a little bit about entropy and the role of the rate of change and entropy within organizations is causing a challenge?
Absolutely. I think entropy has many dimensions to it, which is why we just put cyber in front of it. But look at everything the CIO and their partner, the CISO, are confronted with today. Just yesterday, I was asked for one of our clients to look at a new vendor. The vendor provides environmental monitoring for the physical facilities of the customer. Now, a few years ago, that wasn't even in scope for the CIO, let alone the CISO. That was all in facilities. But that's a very simple yet very obvious example of how the responsibility for the CIO and the CISO have evolved, because it's all network enabled. And it truly is sensing the environment. I mean, there are risk scenarios that could be contrived to explain why the information leaving the business might be at risk. Never mind the fact that it's a life sciences company that's developing medications in manufacturing facilities. And if there was some way to manipulate that information and potentially get to the HVAC, for example, that could damage the operational resiliency. These aren't core business systems as we have traditionally thought about them, but it shows that the entropy in the infrastructure continues to IoT devices in laboratories, for example. We continue to get more and more things added to the plate of the CIO and the CISO. And from a threat perspective, the attack surface of the company continues to grow. But I think more important than all of this is a point you just made a minute ago, Mark, is that it's no longer just the company. We can't just put it in a box. It's the community, because there are so many external dependencies that we have that are inherently critical, like that one example I just brought up. All of that is invisible to most end users in the company. But the entropy continues to grow for the CIO and the CISO.
Yeah.
Let me add a bit to that. Mark, you mentioned digital experience. Because of the pandemic, so much of the entirety in many cases of the customer experience was digital, and the entirety of the employee experience was digital. And the expectations of that interconnected capabilities and work processes and the like just continued to increase. The expectations keep rising. So if you disrupting a system disrupts the entire company, and that wasn't the case not too long ago. But the expectations are going to continue to rise that you can do anything remotely, you can do anything in the environment, and the physical environments are being informed by the digital experience in ways they hadn't been before.
Absolutely. So how do we address this? What do we need to do to help us to deal with the problems we're facing? So we've got this kind of combination of dependency on the digital infrastructure, the digital experience, the digital enterprise, the digital economy, complexity, and a high rate of change in entropy. Joel, how does observability play into this? And how does accurate, up-to-date situational awareness help? Why is that so key? What's the...
It's really hard to be confident of the resilience and operational assurance if you don't have a good understanding of what the dependencies are. you don't know what assets are most important, if you don't even know what assets are in your environment, what connectivity there is to external services and capabilities on which you depend, it's really largely impossible to have the kind of assurance that you need. And I think to Scott's point about the complexity only getting greater, at some point, there's not a human who can handle or have a great understanding of what the full set of dependencies are. They'll have categories and a framework in which they're working, but in the end, you're going to need the support of other systems to identify the assets on which you depend and understand how they're depending on each other. And it's just not, it's getting past the point where individuals can do that.
Yeah. We use a phrase, cognitive scalability. So, collecting all of the information, representing it together to a human being is not enough, because often what you're representing is something that a human being cannot reason with. So it comes back to kind of breaking it down functionally or within whatever kind of dimension that the operator requires, and doing things like representing exceptions. So, representing information that's actionable as opposed to the noise. Yeah, we think that's incredibly important too. Okay, so let's move on a little. We've just started to talk about the solution, but let's explore this a little bit more. So in this highly interconnected digital world, what does this observability need to look like? And if we go back to the European Union's DORA in Article 8, it provides some very clear guidance around the need to continuously identify, classify, and map the interdependencies of critical business functions and important business services. And this allows organizations to assess their risks accurately, to assert their controls, to avoid errors, and to ensure that they can recover to known good when the inevitable incident occurs. If you look at the NIST CSF2, which has recently been published, there is a very clear requirement for the representation of the organization's authorized network communications and internal and external network data flows, and that needs to be maintained. So we have some very clear guidance out there. Scott, you've kind of taken this sort of approach with many organizations before, looking to map application dependencies. Can you describe the benefits that your clients and your organizations have achieved here? And can you talk a little bit about the challenges in even doing this?
Let's start with the challenges, because you've already talked about the cognitive ability of humans to get all this information in their head about a single system. And it's becoming increasingly more difficult for anybody, even the system architect, to fully appreciate all the cascading dependencies. But they also change very rapidly, not as rapidly as some would think, but they're changing on a daily basis. So gathering the information is difficult to getting a known, let's call it a model, right, or a digital twin of my system. But there's also nothing to test that model against. There is no truth table that allows you to look at the model and say, yes, that's an accurate representation, because the reality of the system is so complex. It's not like you're looking at a Boeing 747 and you can actually test whether or not the avionics are working. You don't have that capacity. So complexity, just sheer size, hidden dependencies, and the fact that there's continuous change, all of that makes it difficult. But it's still something we should work on as a community, not as an individual, but as a community. And when I'm speaking to leadership teams about why, first thing I'll say pejoratively is, well, if the adversary's doing it, you should be doing it too. Because adversaries are doing recon on our companies continuously, all the time. Most of the traffic that people call attacks is nothing but surveillance and reconnaissance from threat actors. But more importantly, management needs to be able to answer 5 what imperatives. What is that thing, right? What is its important its importance relative to operational resiliency. The second is, so what? So what if I lose it? Do I have contingencies? What am I not going to be able to do? Am I going to lose a robot that's working on assembly line and it's down for an hour? Hang on a second. That's the entire profit margin for that assembly line for the entire year. That's the so what. The next is what else? Because an adversary they will very, very rarely just take one pin and try to pull it out of the complex system. They will create a more sophisticated attack. The fourth one is what now? What are we going to do about it? How do we make the investments and rationalize a business case to maybe it's, build redundancy, maybe it's build contingency, maybe it's just fortify the controls. But that what now conversation is critical. And the last one is what if. This is where we should be doing tabletops. This is where operational resiliency gets into the boardroom, where we say, what if the financials platform is down? What if manufacturing is disrupted? What if we lose our customer records? What if all of our historical market analytics are all now encrypted? Those 5 what questions are fundamental, and they can't be answered without truly digging into all of your system's dependencies right down into your applications. My favorite example is when we were all pressed to go find Log4j, right? It's this obscure component buried inside of many of the products that we rely on that come from vendors. What if any one of those instances of Log4j were exploited? Without the application dependency mapping, and around that, the system dependency mapping, you can't answer any of the 5 questions, and most importantly, not the what if.
And instead, you're patching tens of thousands of servers because you don't really know what's important.
Exactly.
We saw that. So we're about to move to the demo. I've just got one more point on this, which I'd like to talk to Matt about. So we spend a lot of time working with our customers on the use cases for application dependency mapping. And we talk to them a lot about automating that versus the kind of legacy approach of spreadsheets and manual reconnaissance and doing it annually and using consultants. Can you give us an idea of the issues that we've discovered with our customers about the old ways and how it could be different?
Yeah, just the biggest is just knowledge gaps, right? Even with deploying armies of consultants from Big 3 into your organization and having them run around and interview application owners and maintaining things with clipboards and spreadsheets, we find that there's still knowledge gaps in the organization. Most of the app owners that they even speak to don't always know everything that their apps communicate with. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in one of the next slides. But accuracy, cost, complexity, and then inflexibility of the output are some of the biggest challenges, right? I mean, these organizations are spending millions with these Big 3 firms to have them do this. They're taking moment in time looks that are outdated before they've even published their findings. And because those findings are static, they're not really actionable. You can't do things like alerting against deviations from what's been already discovered. And that's where organizations are starting to see a lot of benefit to deploying a solution kind of like vArmour's, where we're able to come in and dynamically update and dynamically monitor for dependencies and relationships between applications, and then make that data actionable, right? Like alert to deviations from baseline, alert to various different conditions that are detrimental to cyber resiliency use cases. So it's a pretty stark contrast when you compare the automated versus manual approach.
Yeah, a colleague of mine last week called that the virtual tap on the shoulder. So how do I know when I'm drifting? And how do I get informed without having to trawl through the reams and reams and reams of alerts that I have to deal with day to day? Incredibly important. Okay, it seems like we're at a point now where I'm going to hand over to Matt Eben, and Matt Eben's going to talk a little bit about vArmour Relationship Cloud and show us this capability in action. So we'll begin to demonstrate some of the things we've discussed. Thanks, Matt.
Yep. Sure. So let's talk a little bit quickly about what vArmour is and what we do, and that will sort of set the stage for the live demo. So vArmour is a cyber observability and risk management platform. We continuously map out every application and dependency so that organizations can maintain a strong operational secure and compliance posture. We do so without having to deploy any agents or anything like that. We pull telemetry and context information from the environment as it already exists. So what we ultimately deliver is a unified map of all your applications and dependencies across your entire estate. And by doing so, we can empower a number of different use cases. We'll talk a little bit about each of those here. So primarily what we've been speaking about on this webinar is around operational resilience and compliance. So right now we're working with one of the world leading financial organizations whose head of technology risk brought us in to help meet their DORA ICT risk management timelines ahead of the January 2025 deadline. They were attempting to do this manually and were effectively getting nowhere, and told us point blank that we are ground truth to what is communicating in the environment, and that there was no way they'd be able to meet these requirements of January 2025 without bringing in something like vArmour. Attack surface management. So many CISOs that we talk to don't really have a clear picture of their entire digital estate. And because of that, they don't know which applications are communicating with others, what upstream and downstream impacts there will be if an application is compromised. So getting an understanding of all of the dependencies is key to that. Acquisitions, mergers, divestiture. We work with a number of organizations that help with, organizations use us to help map out their entire estate and then map out estates of potential acquisitions, or on the inverse, do divestitures. So we're working with one of the world's leading like lifestyle brands right now around separating out two of their major lines of business. So this is an organization everybody's heard of. They're splitting out one part of the organization from another. The part that's being split out is actually the organization that was hosting all of the IT infrastructure for the shared estate. So by leveraging vArmour to map out the applications and dependencies, they are able to ensure and satisfy their cyber insurers that they are truly divested, that they do not have any kind of cross communication between organizations happening. And then finally, cloud transformation and segmentation readiness. Anybody who's ever attempted to migrate or move applications and assets to the cloud know what a challenge this can be. How do I define my move groups if I don't know what applications are depending on what other applications? Or if I'm looking to do segmentation policy, how do I segment an app if I don't know everything that it's communicating with? We have a customer that used us for this a couple of years back now. They were facing a need to do segmentation around their Swift environment, and they had a pretty a couple month deadline by the time that they brought us in. In the 4 months prior to bringing in vArmour to help map out their application dependencies, they had basically mapped out 10 different things that talk to their Swift environment. And when we talked to them, they said, we think there are probably going to be about 40 or 50 things total, different applications that depend on Swift. We deployed, and within a week, we found 150 application dependencies, and their eyes just were like saucers, like, holy crap. Okay, so this is all stuff we need to account for as we segment this environment. So all of that really comes back to the basic need, though, for that understanding of what are my applications, what are the functions of my applications, and what dependencies do they have in the environment. So rather than talk slides, I think I'll just show it to you. So let me see if BrightTalk is going to cooperate here. We'll click share. Okay, you should be seeing a screen that says risk calcs. So this is, to the point Scott was making before, this is effectively a digital twin of an application in this estate called Risk Calcs. This is a financial services organization. vArmour was deployed to discover the various different communication flows and dependencies around the critical applications in this particular estate. And this is the type of thing that we normally present back to an organization within about a week or two of deploying. So what you're looking at here is the application called risk calcs. Anything within this circle is a constituent function of that application itself, right? So we can see that there's a pretty large Hadoop cluster here of 30 workloads. We have a data lake, we have some risk modeling functions, we have ingest and tokenization. These are all functions of the risk calcs app. We can see upstream and downstream dependencies represented here as well. Risk calcs is downstream of these various different applications, and it's upstream of our customer database, as you might understand, or as you might expect. So by mapping out the application and bringing in label information from things like ServiceNow and other context sources, we present a very rich and dynamic model against which you can start to do condition monitoring and plausible failure scenario testing. So if, for instance, I enable this capability here called show violations, you'll see that a couple of red lines pop up in the system. Because we're monitoring this communication around this app on a continuous basis, we can write some very basic policies and actually some fairly advanced policies by leveraging the various different label permutations to monitor for conditions that we want to see around things like cybersecurity use cases, but also operational resiliency use cases. We're monitoring in this environment for any time that we see a recovery time objective mismatch. So again, we're pulling in things like RTO labels from a CMDB, like a ServiceNow or something, and we're adorning the graph and we're adorning the application visuals with that information. So we can monitor for any time we see something with an RTO of 1, for instance, this back office application talking to predictive pricing, which has an RTO of 4. Pretty common use case for us when we're talking cyber resiliency. One of the other cool things that I wanted to show is starting to do critical point of failure analysis and testing against the system for things like plausible failure scenarios, right? One of the most common things that we've been planning for in like the BRP and BCP function for years is, well, what happens if we lose a site, right? What happens if we lose an area of our estate? So this risk calcs app, if I hover over, for instance, the New York data center, I can see that every function within the risk calcs app lights up, meaning that I have full presence of this application in my New York data center. The resilient site for that, or the backup or active site for that, is Oregon. If I hover over Oregon, you can see that the predictive pricing function is not there. The other interesting thing that pops out to me is that Oregon seems to be the only place that this customer database application actually runs. So let's, for instance, say take New York offline. Let's just untoggle New York and click OK. And sure enough, we see that the predictive pricing function is gone, as is the dependency that was tied into our back office application. So if that's a key function or a key component to the operations and delivery of this business service, taking New York offline means that we're no longer going to be able to service this application. On the flip side, if I were to take Oregon offline, I can see that my predictive pricing comes back, as does my relationship with the back office, but my customer database is gone. I mean, customer database sounds like it would be pretty key for doing something like risk calcs. So I can very quickly spot a couple of key points of failure, or critical points of failure in my resiliency posture around this application by leveraging this digital twin. So there's a lot more that we can show, and we can show if we have a follow-up, but I'm going to stop sharing here and take us back to any Q&A. Mark, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, thank you, Matt, and thank you everyone for the conversation. We have a couple of questions, but only time to really get through one before we have to wrap up. The question comes in from one of our attendees. How is operational resilience different to what we used to call business continuity? What's changed? Who'd like to take that?
I have 2 cents on it, but I don't want to cut the guys off. And
Right.
It goes back to that concept of, business continuity. There was a considerable level of assumption that it was all of those things were within our control. Everything, the physical aspect of the office space, but all the systems, all of our dependencies were ours. And in operational resiliency today, it's a community. We rely on a community of components that all work together. And we have to have the visibility into that. And our BCP needs to adhere to that. It isn't just disaster recovery of our own components. It's all of those external things that we critically rely on and potentially have single points of failure with.
Thank you. Joel?
I think that hits it. So much of the business continuity was about where you're going to work and how do you resume the business. It was business resumption planning.
Yeah.
As business continuity came to the fore as opposed to a resumption, I think operational resilience is not taking the hit in the first place. That is, even if you have a challenge, not having it affect current operations is going to be increasingly important. And to Scott's point, it's not all within the local control.
Yeah, I think there's an anticipation, an avoidance, and an adaptation that's inherent within the thinking of operational resilience, which, if you think about it, if you can avoid or anticipate an incident or a scenario, you're serving your customers and your business far better because the disruption is limited. I think the other, having come from a world where I spent a lot of time with resilience, when you look at the classical business continuity scenarios that we were planning for, they were very seldom the things that actually hurt us. It would often be a change that was planned badly. It could have been some sort of cyber activity. These days it's a migration. So I think that operational resilience broadens this and makes you think a little bit more carefully about your general operational practice. And I think that's very welcome.
Right.
Matt, do you have anything to add before we thank these gentlemen and wrap up?
No, I think you guys hit the nail on the head. I don't really have anything else to add.
Okay. Well, I just want to apologize to our attendees for running over by a couple of minutes, but when you get these kind of characters together, we often can't stop talking. So thank you everyone for attending. I hope this has been useful, and thank you to my fellow panelists for your time and your expertise. If you'd like to learn more about operational resilience and how vArmour can help, please take a look at our website. Also, Phenomenati, as the guy said, offer all sorts of services around virtual CIO, virtual CISO, and consulting. Real experts in this area. So once again, thank you everybody for your attendance, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.